Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel and welcome to a wee April 10th edition of Celtic Transfer Talk. You might think that's early, considering where we are right now, but we've had Celtic transfer talks already over these past few weeks. The rumours are getting ridiculous, including one that came out last night suggesting that Celtic are still looking at a goalkeeper who was apparently close to joining us last summer. All of that alongside a story which suggests that one of our winter transfer targets was actually really close to signing for Celtic in January. Yeah, we have quite a lot to talk about, so bear with me and roll that intro. If you haven't already, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. We are less than 100 subscribers away from 49,000, which means we are so close to 50k. Can we get there by the end of the season? That is the challenge I set amongst you. Go down below, hit both of those buttons, and let's get into this edition of Celtic Transfer Talk. Let me just preface all of this conversation by saying that it is that point of the season where clicks are hard to get, where interest naturally dwindles. We're on that kind of boring run till the end of the season until trophies are lifted. A lot of people tune out, and newspapers, podcasters, YouTubers, they all need clicks somehow. And last night, I think a story sort of summed all of that up, because headlines are once again suggesting that Celtic are in for Martin Dubravka. Yes, the Newcastle backup goalkeeper who was linked with the club last summer. Some reports suggesting that Celtic are still looking at Martin Dubravka. And to be honest, I can't help but feel it's just utter nonsense. So these were the headlines last night in the Newcastle Chronicle, suggesting there is a Celtic link at the club right now. Of course, that club being Newcastle United. If you scrolled down the article, you would see that Celtic are apparently keen on Martin Dubravka. The 35-year-old has just signed a new deal at Newcastle, but that hasn't stopped him gaining interest from Parkhead. Celtic have tied down Kasper Schmeichel for another season, but Martin Dubravka has still been looked at by Celtic, with Newcastle likely to bring in another keeper. With James Trafford and Aaron Ramsdale on the radar, Dubravka's squad status may change again in pre-season. Decisions are also due on backup men like John Ruddy and Mark Gillespie. Having protected themselves by negotiating a contract extension for Dubravka, Newcastle can now command a fee for his services, with the threat of a free transfer in the rear view mirror. So, Celtic apparently still floating around Martin Dubravka, following last year's interest, where we were told there was a real good chance Celtic could sign him. There was a point where some articles and outlets were suggesting that he was going to be the keeper Celtic signed. That didn't happen. We signed Kasper Schmeichel. Thank God we signed Kasper Schmeichel. And I remember saying last summer I would be stunned if Martin Dubravka is the keeper that Celtic go for, and that I thought it was going to amount to nothing. And I'm going to say it with my chest one more time. I think this is a story which will amount to nothing. I was very vocal about how much I didn't want Celtic to sign Martin Dubravka last year, because there was a run of form that he went on that suggested he was nowhere near good enough. He was obviously back up for Newcastle, but in his performances, when he did get to play, there was enough to suggest that he was pretty washed, as the kids would say. I will go as far to say that opinion stays exactly the same, despite coming into the team a little bit this season when needed and performing reasonably well. I just don't think it makes any sense. And I ask you the question at home, if you're watching this video, what sense do you think signing Martin Dubravka makes? Because we simply don't need him. And for somebody who has just signed a new contract at Newcastle, where he's probably on a decent wage, let's be real, where they would actually want money for us to sign him, There's nothing about this move that makes sense for Celtic when we have three goalkeepers at the club. Kasper Schmeichel, Vinny Sinisalo and Scott Bain are all still here. Scott Bain does actually play a part in this Celtic squad because he's part of the homegrown quota registration for Champions League games. Kasper Schmeichel is naturally number one, and Vinny Sinisalo is the understudy at number two. Why would Celtic go out their way to sign Martin Dubravka, a player on a bigger wage for a fee, to replace Vinny Sinisalo, who's a pretty decent number two as it is? I just don't think it would make any sense, especially at the age Dubravka is at. He would be coming in to sit in the bench for a year until Schmeichel is gone, and then that's when we should either be looking at an even better option or naturally bringing Sinisalo in to be number one. Why should Dubravka take that place? It just makes no sense. I think this story is pretty much nonsense, but I can see where it may have came from. When Kasper Schmeichel first picked up his injury on international duty, there was a lot of speculation about how long he could be out for. There was suggestions he could even be out until September, which obviously meant he would miss a very vital part of the season for Celtic, the Champions League qualifiers, potentially the first derby of the season, and that would be big. That would be a huge loss, and you're relying on someone as inexperienced as Vinny Sinisalo to come in, pick up where he left off, and carry Celtic through a really tough run of games. So there is always the possibility that in that doubt, in that position that Celtic were in, maybe to replace Kasper Schmeichel for a while, they were considering bringing in Dubravka on some sort of free transfer or short-term deal, maybe even a 6-month loan, just to get through the first part of the season while Schmeichel recovered. That's the only way for me that it can make any sort of sense that Celtic were looking at his name. But aside from that, I don't think there's anything we can take from this story as gospel. I think it's one that will come and go, and unless we're in for any shock exits this summer, unless there's big news to come that maybe they want to loan out Sinisalo so he's playing first team football, I just don't see why Martin Dubravka would become a Celtic player, and I don't necessarily want Martin Dubravka to become a Celtic player. I would give this the big Ryan 118 stamp of shite approval. Now, in the January transfer window, Celtic were heavily linked with wingers throughout the month. We obviously ended up signing Jota towards the end, but several wingers were linked with the club, and one was linked more than others, that being a Sondre Ørjasæter of Norway, who currently plays in the Norwegian top flight for Sarpsborg 08. Now, he was linked with the club quite heavily. In fact, there was transfer reports suggesting that he was signing, that it was done, that he would become a Celtic player in the January window, that we had submitted a bid and it was accepted. It looked like it was happening, and then it just kind of faded away into nothing. We heard nothing else really on top of that. There was no update about the transfer collapsing or anything. It just went away after we signed Jota. It seems like everything was forgotten, and I think people assumed that the story must have been nonsense. However, today, Sondre Ørjasæter in an interview revealed he was pretty close to signing. In fact, in his head, he was probably going to be a Celtic player. So in an interview, Sondre Ørjasæter revealed that he carried his passport everywhere in the hope of a Celtic transfer, but he was relieved that the move ended up not happening. Now, not relieved for any sort of negative connotations. It wasn't like he's looking at Celtic and going, oh, thank God I never went to that huge club. It was for reasons that we'll explain in a moment, but essentially, Ørjasæter was prepared for the move. He was carrying his passport everywhere he went, expecting the signing to happen or the move to happen at some point, and it just didn't. So, if we have a look deeper into the interview, he said that they were brutal days for him in January because he struggled to sleep. He didn't know if he was going to be in Norway or not. He could have moved at any moment, and he had to carry his passport everywhere he went. And when the window closed, I felt a sense of relief. I came to the conclusion that I was determined to stay in Sarpsborg and play here because I didn't know if I was ready to leave yet. Now, it's nuts because apparently Celtic were going to sign him for £7 million. A very young player in the Norwegian top flight. A lot of money to pay for a player in that Norwegian top flight. And it looked as though it was going to happen. Ørjasæter convinced it was going to happen. And it just didn't. And he's glad it didn't, because he doesn't know personally if he was ready for the step up. He had a lot of pressure on himself. He talks about the stress in this interview. So by the sounds of it, not for any bad reasons, it's maybe for the best that Celtic didn't trigger this move in January. He went on to say that going abroad is now another level up. It had become more professional and everything. There was many thoughts going through my head in that period. If I get a little more time in Sarpsborg, I think I'll mature and I'll be ready for it eventually. Of course, you will have a better life after your career if you have more money in your account, but you only live once. For me, it's just as important to have fun along the way. It is probably even more important. I have a lot of friends to keep me grounded. I think I only had my football. I think if I only had football, my head would explode. You know what? I really like the guy. I like this, and this is the sort of player that I would love to have at Celtic. And I hope that we're continuing our scouting of him. I hope we're watching his development. And trust me, when he's ready for the move, after looking through this interview today, and there's a lot more to it, I'd happily see him come to Celtic. It's refreshing to hear these sorts of comments. And I'm really glad that one way or another this move fell through, because I think it will be better for him, and he's been very, very honest about that. We see it far too often in football nowadays, especially down south, where young players bite the hand off at the big move too quick, and they fade into irrelevance. They struggle with the commands of stepping up. They just aren't ready. And I like that Sondre Ørjasæter has done the opposite of what a lot of these players do now in the hope for a big paycheck, and that's just, being honest about where he is and where he is in his development. I like that. I like that a lot. And sometimes at Celtic, I wish players would do that. Obviously, we hope and pray that our big players won't leave for the big move when the time comes. And most of them do. You look at Matt O'Reilly, granted injuries have been in the way, but he's moved to Brighton. It's not quite went his way yet. And maybe he needed another year or two at Celtic just to get that level up. And I like that Ørjasæter's been very, very honest about that. And that's the kind of attitude I'd love to see in more Celtic players. So I hope we're continuing our scouting of him. And it's probably happened for the best now, because if he did sign, he's clearly a boy that was under a lot of stress in January. Now, we've seen what happened when Nicholas Kuhn first arrived to Celtic, and he was pretty hopeless. And there was a lot of medical issues and stuff alongside it. I get that, but it looked as though he was struggling to deal with the step up. And if we signed this young lad for £7 million, the pressure would have been on him big time. Big time. And fans would have turned against him quickly, as we know the nature of our support sometimes. And he didn't do that to himself. He didn't put himself under unnecessary pressure. He's waited, and he's continuing his development at Sarpsborg. And when he's ready for the move, he'll move where it is. And I'm hoping it could be Celtic. So let's keep watching him and let's see how he keeps doing, because I like the attitude of the boy. In fact, he started the season pretty well for Sarpsborg in the 2025 campaign, which has just kicked off very recently. In the first 2 games, he already has 2 assists to his name from the left wing. That's off the back of last season, where he scored 6 and assisted 7 inside 32 games. A pretty decent return for a 20-year-old winger at the time. So yeah, Celtic will naturally continue following him, you would assume, especially if he was very, very close to completing a move to the club. But a refreshing interview. I actually, enjoyed reading it. If you can go and check out the full thing, I'd recommend it. You'll find it if you just search his name on Google. Let's see what happens over the next couple of years. Right then, that does it for today. If you enjoyed, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. Let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. And we're recording the Celtic the Thunder podcast tonight, so if you haven't already and you want to drop in any questions, make sure to check the Celtic the Thunder Twitter account to leave them there. But until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time.